During the press conference today. Joining us is conservative immigration critic Michelle Rempel. I believe Ms. Rempel has an opening remark, and then we'll open it up to questions after that.
Thank you so much. It's my understanding that the Prime Minister will be making himself available to media this afternoon in Montreal to deal with the illegal migrant crisis that has accelerated in Canada over the last several months. You know, I find it very curious that this is the first time, for all intents and purposes, that the Prime Minister has made himself available, given that we're now at the point where the government has responded by setting up tent cities at the U.S.-Canada border. I have to express my frustration ahead of the Prime Minister's media availability that this availability is only happening now after months of opposition criticism, of months of opportunity in the House of Commons for him to respond to this. The Liberals refused an emergency debate on this issue. The Liberals refused a committee study on this particular issue. And here we are at the 11th hour, heading into winter with tent cities at our border when the Prime Minister is finally coming out. So I predict the Prime Minister will do several things this afternoon. First of all, I predict that he will continue to downplay the situation. The message from the government thus far has been nothing to see here, folks. We're monitoring the situation. This is all normal. This is regular. I think that anybody who has been responding to this crisis, be it in Emerson or in Cornwall or now in Montreal, would disagree, as well as the people that are, you know, risking their lives in a lot of situations to cross the border. The second thing that I predict that he'll do is downplay the role that his actions have had in breaking our once compassionate asylum claim system. Our system now is in shambles, and I think a lot of this has to do with the messaging, the inconsistent messaging that has been coming out of Justin Trudeau's personal communication shop. I also expect him to continue to ignore the facts, and I would like to recap what some of the facts are in this situation. First of all, we are on track. Recent reports have shown that we are on track, that asylum claims could hit as high as or over 36,000 claims this year. This is an extremely high amount of claims. This is fact, and the government does not have a plan to either to deal with processing or with housing or the impact that these types of claims will have on Canada's social assistance programs this year. The other thing that he will ignore is the fact that this massive spike in a very short period of time of asylum claims will have an inordinate and significant backlog, creating an inordinate and significant backlog within the Immigration and Refugee Board. I want to be clear about this. Internal government reports have predicted and forecasted that the asylum claim wait time could be as long as 11 years, with current projected numbers of asylum claims that are crossing the border and the backlog that currently exists. I would like to talk about that backlog and why it's here. It's not just the situation at the border of the United States-Canadian border. It's also exacerbated by the fact that the government has made several other decisions which are projected to affect asylum claims. The first was the lift of the Mexican visa requirement without a formal government review. Again, there have been many reports coming out of your shops that show, and the government itself, that the government actually expects to see spikes in asylum claims coming out of Mexico and subsequently other countries where the visa lifts are expected to take place, and that is also adding to the burden on the asylum claim system. I also believe, I firmly believe, that because the government has not been consistent on their messaging on people crossing the border illegally into Canada, on what the expectations are, that hashtag Welcome to Canada tweet has never been clarified by the Prime Minister. He's been asked directly whether or not he feels that that tweet had any sort of impact on, you know, the fact that he's saying this and our asylum claim system is functioning in a different way. I think that that is also adding to the burden. I think he's giving false hope to people crossing the border, and I don't expect that he will address that in any sort of way, and I expect that because he won't this afternoon, that will continue to add pressure to the IRB backlog. The other fact that I expect him to look the other way on is that we have had reports around people with criminal backgrounds entering the country. A lead in a story today says the Canada Border Services Agency can't say how many people it has detained for security or health reasons after crossing near Emerson, as more asylum seekers continue to enter Manitoba from the United States. If I understand that the public safety minister today gave a message which basically said, no, there's nothing to see here, folks. Well, then why are they hiding this information? I don't expect the Prime Minister, unfortunately, to address this, because for months in the House of Commons, we have been asking him about this particular issue, and that data has not been forthcoming. This is in spite of the fact that, again, media reports have shown that we've had Somalis with criminal records coming to Canada from the U.S. This isn't something that I'm making up. This is in the news. And the fact that we're showing that refugee claimants have been found in possession of child pornography. I hope that the Prime Minister will address this, but I don't expect him to. The other fact that he will ignore is that nobody is fleeing persecution from the United States. This isn't me saying this. This is the fact that the Liberal government has upheld the Safe Third Country Agreement. The Prime Minister of this country needs to send a very strong message that the United States of America is a safe, stable democracy, that we certainly consider to have a safe and stable asylum claim system. This is why the Safe Third Country Agreement applies. And he certainly needs to, I think, have a stronger message on that, but I don't expect him to do so this afternoon. The last fact that I expect him to ignore is that it is irresponsible, and it has been irresponsible, to give false hope to people crossing the border that somehow, if they're crossing the border illegally and making an asylum claim, especially with the Safe Third Country Agreement in place, that their claim will somehow be validated if it was not found valid in the United States. This is a fact. We know that many asylum claims in this particular situation are found to be invalid by the Immigration Refugee Board, and I believe that this is something else that the government needs to make a much stronger message on. I also expect the Prime Minister this afternoon, rather than to address any of these particular problems, is to simply rehash and tout some of the Band-Aid solutions that they've put forward in recent days. It is completely irresponsible, and I find it completely ridiculous that the Prime Minister of Canada would tout a tent city. Think about this for a second. There's a tent city on the U.S.-Canada border as a solution to deal with this influx of people from the United States ahead of winter months. We're not that far away from frost. Let's be honest here. So if the government is saying that their solution is to set up a tent city, a committee that doesn't have a mandate, that hasn't been explained to Canadians, after months and months and months of trying to deal with this in Ottawa, I find that completely egregious. The other things that I don't expect him, or I expect him to tout that there won't be any more details on, is that they've said that they have some sort of an education system in process to help people understand this. Well, what is the mandate of that? What's the plan? What are they doing with this? And how come the Prime Minister of Canada hasn't had a more direct role in that? I don't expect him to address that this afternoon as well. I'm sorry to be so dismal on this, but you'll forgive me if I'm slightly cynical. We have been talking and asking the government for months to deal with this situation, and we have heard no action. A photo op after a meeting will not cut it. The Prime Minister of Canada, in order to help the world's most vulnerable and to salvage the Canadian asylum claim system, needs to come up with a credible plan, and he needs to explain it to Canadians. Thank you.
All right, so I know we have a number of questions to get through so far today. If we can keep it to as tight as possible, one question, one follow-up, we'll go one round. Then if there's time afterwards for more questions, we'll kind of play it by ear. So we'll start off then with Manon Cornelier, with Le Devoir.
Mrs. Rempel, I just want to know,
Madame Rempel.
how would you deal with this right now? You have a concern with the tent city. I understand all your concern, but when those people are crossing the border, what do you want the government to do with them?
Well, for months we've been saying that, first of all, the government needs to acknowledge that there's a problem, right? I think, again, when I say I don't expect the government to acknowledge that, I think that that's probably step number one. I think that from there, there's a lot of things that the government has systemically created this problem in the last 18 months. Inconsistent messaging, some of the other tangential policy decisions, such as the Mexican visa lift, which have created a huge backlog at the Immigration Refugee Board. I've been very outspoken in recent days, as has my party, around the dysfunction, and I certainly don't want to disparage the people that are working hard at the IRB right now, but I mean, the turnaround time is it's not acceptable. And until that problem is fixed, the message that's being sent to the world is that you can come to Canada even if you don't have a valid claim, and draw on the benefits of that are available to people in that situation. My concern there is that we know that one of the greatest public policy challenges facing the world right now is the migrant crisis. There are many people around the world that have legitimate asylum claims to make in Canada. What sort of a message does it say to those people? So I think that he needs to address that. I guess I'll close with this. The Prime Minister has put us in this situation. He has had every opportunity for, 9 months now to address this with a credible plan. So what does he need to do? He needs to have a plan, and he needs to explain it to Canadians. Under our Conservative government, our system worked efficiently and compassionately. So to me, this is his problem, and this is something that he needs to be held to account by Canadians on.
You haven't answered my precise question. I understand that it was, you said it was working under the Conservative government, but you were never facing this kind of situation at the border.
Well,
what are you doing? You didn't give me specific action that the government should do.
Sure.
Should they turn them back? Should they drive them with bus to the border? What should they do?
Sure. So again, let's talk about why we weren't facing this situation under our Conservative government. Our Conservative government didn't tweet out #Welcome to Canada while the Safe Third Country Agreement was in place, and also after lifting the Mexican visa requirement without having a formal review. I think that these particular actions sent an unrealistic message to the world on what the Canadian asylum claim system did or would be capable of. So, I want to be perfectly clear. This is a problem that is of the Prime Minister's making. We weren't seeing this as an issue in the past for a reason. So because of that, because we had a system that worked, I think about some of the things that our former government did to make the IRB more efficient, including, the designated country of origin program, which aimed to have claims from those areas processed in days. Those were the sorts of proactive measures that our government put in place to make sure that this situation wouldn't happen. This is a problem that is of the government's making. I expect them to acknowledge that it's a problem, expect them to acknowledge the facts on this, and then I expect them to put forward a plan to fix it. This is their situation to fix.
Okay, Kevin Gallagher, CTV News.
Ms. Rempel, what do you think of Emmanuel DeBoer's mission now to Miami to speak with some of these potential asylum seekers, possibly to better explain how the system in Canada would work? What do you think about that particular mission?
I think functionally, until the IRB is in a position to process some of these claims in a very short period of time, and that when invalid claims, which a majority of those claims will be, are then those claimants are returned to their country of origin, I think until that situation happens, the situation will not improve.
I just want to follow up. I mean, when you're talking about the Conservative immigration record and how that system worked then, and saying that this is all of the Liberal policies making now, we're talking about a completely different political climate. I mean, I want you to talk about the signs, like the anti-migrant signs that have been up on the Olympic Plaza in Montreal. I mean, obviously there's a lot of different rhetoric coming from the United States. There's a migrant crisis that you did reference, so it's a completely different climate. What more could the Liberals really have done, and what more should be done right now?
Your question is predicated on the assumption, or uses the assumption, that the United States is no longer a safe country. I would argue otherwise. I understand certainly that there is, situations happening in the U.S., but that said, overall, the United States, I would argue rather strongly that the United States remains one of the strongest, most stable democracies in the world. But you don't have to take my word for it. The fact that the Liberal immigration minister has come out and repeatedly upheld the Safe Third Country Agreement says that Justin Trudeau thinks that the United States is a safe country, and that the context that your question is in is irrelevant to the processing of asylum claims. I don't understand why the Prime Minister won't just say that. Why won't the, and if the Prime Minister has questions on whether or not he thinks that the United States somehow is not a place where asylum claims can be safely made, that it's no longer a safe third country, then he needs to say that. I think that would have significant implications not only on Canada's asylum claim system, but also on the international community as well. There's a reason why we use the IRB and arm's length processes to adjudicate asylum claims, or whether or not we deem countries to be safe or not. And we have to look at facts. I don't think that you would have any sort of public servant, or I think if you had the Prime Minister here, or if you had the Immigration Minister and you press them, they would have to say that the United States is a safe third country. If they didn't, oh boy, I think that would be an interesting conversation, wouldn't it?
Okay, Katie Simpson, CBC News.
My question goes sort of to that theme that you were just talking about right now. Do you not think, though, even though the U.S. is, it's still a safe democracy, do you not think the attitude toward immigration and migration has changed, and there is a factor outside of what's going on in Canada that is contributing to this spike?
Well, we have to, in order to be compassionate in an asylum claim system, and in order to ensure that that compassion is delivered in an efficient way, we have to rely on facts. We can't make decisions based on feelings or, subjective articles in a newspaper. We have to rely on a system that looks at quantitative measures on whether or not, if somebody is fleeing persecution in a certain situation, comes to another country and makes an asylum claim, if they will no longer face that persecution anymore. Every country is going to go through periods of ups and downs. I don't want to comment on the American situation because we have an obligation and a sovereignty in Canada to look at our borders and look at our systems. Canada, in our system, Canada has a quantitative process to evaluate whether or not a country is considered a safe third country. I have heard nothing out of the Liberal government that says that they believe otherwise. That's a determination for them to make. We have to be very careful when we're looking at something as sensitive and as necessary as an asylum claim system to start tinkering with it on things that aren't quantitative. And this is why, I think that the Prime Minister needs to be very factual on where he stands on this. I bet you he would have trouble answering your question, Katie. I do think he would, because I think sometimes he wants to give a wink and a nod to one faction without acknowledging the reality of Canada's asylum claim system. And that's dangerous. That gives false hope to people who are illegally crossing the border. We've already seen a woman freeze to death. And I also think that it leads to really polarized debate around this issue. I want to be clear. This is not a question of if we should have an asylum claim system in Canada or if Canada should help the world's most vulnerable. It's a question of how. And because the government has so spectacularly failed on the how, we're now having a lot of Canadians question the social license around and the legitimacy of Canada's and the integrity of Canada's immigration system. And again, that lies solely at the feet of Justin Trudeau.
How big, as a follow-up, how big of an impact do you think that tweet had from when Justin Trudeau was responding to Donald Trump announcing the ban on Muslims and travel? How big of an impact do you think that tweet that Justin Trudeau put out has had on the situation?
Well, I, out of everyone, have learned that tweets have a great degree of import on the public dialogue. It's the situation that we live in. When you think about, if you Googled that tweet right now and the number of ships it launched in terms of media stories around the world, and then the government's response, this very magnanimous yes, hashtag welcome to Canada, that contrast that they drew, I absolutely think that set the tone. Man, was that ever irresponsible? Again, I don't think you'd find one person of any political stripe in Canada. I think about our party and some of the work that we've done this year around persecuted minorities like the Yazidi people. Everybody in Canada wants to help. We're a country that's built on immigration and helping, the world's most needy. It's a question of how. Saying hashtag welcome to Canada when in reality, in that situation, people are illegally crossing the border under the Safe Third Country Agreement in -30 conditions. Come on. That's ridiculous. 11-year, this isn't me making it up, forecasted 11-year backlogs in the IRB. What's going to happen to the social assistance programs in the provinces when this isn't budgeted for? I absolutely think that it had a problem, and it made a problem, and he needs to correct it.
Okay, Michelle Zilio with the Globe and Mail.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions today. I wanted to follow up on a press release that you issued last week where you highlighted the asylum seekers crossing the border with child pornography. You've also mentioned asylum seekers with criminal records. Who do you believe these asylum seekers are?
You know, again, Michelle, like I want to be clear on where my party's position is on the asylum system writ large. I firmly believe, and my party believes, that Canada should have a robust, open, and welcoming asylum claim system. That's the role of Canada. It's a pride of many Canadians. So let's be clear on that. I also think that it is reasonable to ask, in a situation which is uncontrolled right now, right? People are crossing the border in an uncontrolled fashion, that, you know, it's reasonable to say, like, okay, what are the RCMP doing to screen this? How are we preventing people that may have backgrounds such as this coming into the country? You know, it's not for me to determine who these people are. It's me to determine the fact that we have a problem in the numbers that are coming across the border and how we're managing the situation. The fact that this has come up as a concern in reports in the media, I think, is something that the government needs to respond to. It's not like when I read this story today, then the public safety minister's response was, well, you know, there's nothing to see here and don't worry about it, yet they're not releasing the numbers on that. I can't answer your question, right? It should be them answering the question. I don't have the numbers to look at today. I only have what the reports are in the media. Why wouldn't the government release those numbers? That's for them to answer. There's so many unanswered questions around this that could have been put to bed for months now. And it's now getting to that point where it's this confluence of situation that I think a lot of Canadians are going, as this Ipsos poll said, we don't believe the government has a plan on it. And that doesn't help gain legitimacy for our asylum system long term.
But by drawing attention to criminal records and, you know, the few migrants who had possession of child pornography, are you not concerned that you're drawing you're contributing to an anti-migrant or anti-immigration narrative in this country?
Well, I guess I would flip the question back at you. Is it irresponsible for the media to publish these headlines that I then responded to?
Groups like the Rebel Media have been drawing attention to the child pornography aspects. So are you contributing to that?
Well, actually, the child pornography story I'm looking at was from Global News.
Okay, Dylan Robertson with the Winnipeg Free Press.
Hi, Ms. Rempel. I was wondering if you could clarify your party's policy on the Safe Third Country Agreement. I know when you went to Emerson, you talked about closing a loophole, and I wasn't clear on what that loophole was. And
Sure.
I know with Scheer, right before the break, he said we're going to come up with a policy. Does the party have one now on the agreement?
Well, certainly we're in an exciting time in our party where we're looking at a wide variety of policy options across different subject areas. It's a great time to be a parliamentarian in the Conservative Party of Canada. That said, I raised the Safe Third Country Agreement in the context of Justin Trudeau's tweets and some of the messages that have been raised around the expectations for people who are illegally crossing the border. I'm concerned about that particular loophole exacerbating the backlog at the IRB. You know, when we're talking about how do we fix the situation at the IRB, I'm a conservative. I don't think that the first answer should always be you throw more money at the problem. We have to look at structural, systemic issues. So I think given the situation that the Prime Minister has put himself here, he is probably going to have to look at the Safe Third Country Agreement. But, I'll push back on, from a technical perspective, a lot of people will raise the Geneva Convention that deals with asylum seekers. There's an article within there, Article 31, when this was originally negotiated, that the spirit of that was such that if you have reached a safe third country, there's nothing in that convention that says that you should be allowed to essentially go claim asylum in another country once you've already done that. And the reason why I raise this is that I think it's important for us, given the severity of the global migrant crisis, to understand the spirit of that agreement, especially when we're looking at forecast 11-year backlogs and the potential implications that it has on Canada's social assistance systems. It's going to cost a lot of money, right? So I think writ large, the government has a lot of work to do to look at a variety of different policy areas, and this is something that my party has been very much seized with, meeting with experts, coming up with different opinions, and certainly that's something that we'll be focused on as we head into the fall session. I'll be very curious to see what Justin Trudeau actually says this afternoon at his photo op.
And just to clarify, I didn't quite understand, when you do say close the loophole, you do mean to, send people back to the States?
Sure. So to be clear, the Safe Third Country Agreement governs, to paraphrase, if somebody's making an asylum claim in the United States, if they try to enter Canada through, let's say, an airport or an official land crossing, essentially it's saying, You've reached a Safe Third Country agreement. You can't make an asylum claim here, in a paraphrased way. The agreement is virtually, it's kind of silent on what happens if you illegally cross the border, right? So that particular, if you classify it as a loophole, right, has what a lot of people concerned about in terms of exacerbating the situation. So that certainly is a policy area that I think will have to be looked at, given the severity of the situation that Canada's facing right now.
Sorry, I need to clarify your statement before. It was close the loophole. Now you're saying look at the loophole?
No, I mean, certainly I think, just to be clear, I think that that particular issue, the fact that the agreement is silent on that, is a problem, and that it is definitely exacerbating the situation. But you asked me specifically, where my party's at. We're very concerned about that. I'm kind of feeling like I'm going to scoop myself if I talk about it. But I also think that the Prime Minister himself, I want to see what he has to say first and then respond to it. Because this, again, we weren't having this conversation in 2015.
Okay, and I think, were we out of time? Or?
No, just one round.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, sorry, just double checking there. So Megan Campbell with Maclean's.
I'm just interested in what message you'd like to send to the potential migrants to be who are still in the States. In response to, I think, Katie's question,
Sure.
You talked about a tweet launching a lot of ships. I was talking to a Haitian immigration lawyer in Florida, where it's home to one of the biggest Haitian communities in the States. And she was saying that actually a main mode of communication within the Haitian community there is the radio. There's a radio station in Creole that is, or I guess it's in Creole and English, but it's called Radio Mega. And I was curious, if you had, say, 30 seconds of airtime on Radio Mega, talking directly to this community, what would you say?
Sure. I would say that Canada, virtually everyone in Canada shares a desire to help the world's most vulnerable, and we have a strong track record of helping Haiti and those from Haiti, especially after the earthquake and in light of the political situation. But then I'd also have to have a hard conversation. If I was a Liberal communicating on this, I'd have to say it was under Justin Trudeau's government that the amnesty for people without status, Haitian persons without status in Canada, so asylum seekers, that for deportation, that had expired. And then I'd also point out the fact that I think it's about half of the asylum claims that were made by Haitians in 2016 in Canada were rejected. And then I would also point out that because Canada has the Safe Third Country agreement, that if they illegally cross the border under the terms of that agreement, it would be even more unlikely that somebody's claim would be found to be valid. I'd also talk about the fact that, crossing the border, especially considering crossing the border going into the winter months, is something that's not safe. Canada is compassionate. We don't want people to be risking their life or, going through unsafe and illegal methods to do that. I would also talk about the fact that if you enter the country through an illegal mode of entry, you will be detained by the RCMP. This is something that Justin Trudeau has to fix, but I certainly hope at some point in time he'll be able to say your claim would be quickly processed, and in most situations, you would be returned directly to your country of origin. there's nothing to stop the Liberals from talking about compassion. I want to talk about compassion. It's difficult to talk about compassion when the system is so broken right now. So, that would be my message. But I guess, why is it me? Where's the Prime Minister on this? Why is the opposition the lone voice of reason in the wilderness? And that's really up to him to rectify.
Was there a follow-up with that, or? No? Okay.
Good.
Stephanie Levitz with the Canadian Press.
Hi, Michelle.
Yes.
I actually want to follow up a bit on my colleague's question over there, and you talk about the opposition being the lone voice of reason in the wilderness. When the whole Omar Khadr thing was happening, yourself and a lot of other, some other conservatives went to the U.S. You went directly to the U.S. media to talk about this issue, but no one. It seems as though a lot of the opposition has been in Canada, focused at Canadians, and the government, nor the opposition, has been down in the U.S. talking to the populations who would come here. And I'm wondering what you make of that, what you make of the fact that only last week were Canadian consulates spooled up to start doing any outreach, and why folks like yourself haven't been going on Radio Omega in Miami and trying to clear
Well, I
this
guess,
up.
first of all, I'm not sure what the rules are anymore. Look, right now, I think, Canada has to have a really strong position, especially on NAFTA, especially when we consider the amount of jobs that are at stake in Canada. There are really high-level issues that I think the government needs to be super strong on when I look at the long-term success of our country. It's difficult for me as an opposition member to say, well, why aren't you out correcting the government's mistake in the United States? Like, that's a little unfair, right? I think sorry, on the immigration, because you asked me, what would the message be, or why haven't you been out in the U.S. on immigration? I actually don't know what the government's policy is. What would I be selling? I mean, Justin Trudeau hasn't come out and said it's illegal, you will be intercepted, I've fixed the IRB such that a claim is being processed and I will deport you back to your country of origin. Is that his policy? I don't know. This is why the government needs to have a strong position. I know that I've talked to a few people around, you talk about the consulates being deployed. What is the consulate's message? Like, if you talk to a consular official right now, what are they being asked to say? Like, what is the wait time? What are the penalties? I don't know what the government's position is, and I think that's why it's so difficult for members of the media to get any details from the immigration minister or the public safety minister on this, because, I closed the conference by saying I don't think they have a plan. Again, it's my role, as I think we've been doing for the last several months, to point out this is a problem. There should be common sense solutions to deal with this. And the frustration is that the government has not, A, acknowledged the problem. It has not, B, owned up to some of the facts of it. And C, there's no plan. A tent city is not a plan. I'm sorry. It's just not. It's completely unsustainable and unrealistic. So, I would say Trudeau will be out in Montreal this afternoon. Ask him that.
I guess just as a follow-up on that, then, do you think the messaging is going to the wrong place right now that's coming from the government?
I don't think there is messaging at this point in time.
Okay, and Fanny Olivier with Radio Canada.
I was just wondering, do you think that Donald Trump's policy on immigration has anything to do? Does he have any responsibility of what's happening currently in Canada right now?
Well, I think Canada is a sovereign nation. We are a country that is responsible for setting our own policy on immigration. Certainly, we have to react to world events. But the focus that I have right now is how is Canada's immigration system functioning? And this is where, when I was answering Katie's question, it's so important for us to rely on strong, smart, efficient processes that depoliticize the situation, right? When we start asking quantitatively, like if somebody who is from the LGBT community is fleeing from a state like Iran, where they're likely going to flee death, and they make a claim in the United States, will they be safe in that country? Right? Those are the sorts of, I'm giving sort of a high-level example, but there are quantitative criteria that our country uses to make those determinations. We need to rely on that so that we're not devolving into speculation and sort of polarized discussion on immigration. I'm a firm believer that it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. But if we don't get the how right, that's where we sort of get into that speculative nature. I think it's really important right now for the government to focus on Canada's sovereignty and how Canada treats the global migrant crisis.
All right, did I miss anyone who did not get to ask a question? Yeah, okay, Hélène Bizetti with Le Devoir.
It's still not clear to me what your solution is. I understand we're in the situation we're in. I understand that you think that Justin Trudeau is responsible for that situation, but that's the situation. So what is your proposal? Do you want to shift people back?
Just to get some clarity on that, because I've repeated this point many times, like, do you think that Justin Trudeau has had any culpability in this situation?
I'm not here to answer questions. You are.
Okay, well, I mean, predicated on that assumption, I'll go with that then. Again, I know what we would have done in a Conservative government. I'll reiterate it. We wouldn't have tweeted out #Welcome to Canada, 5 minutes after the American government made an executive order on immigration. We put in place, we looked at proactive solutions around processing times at the Immigration Refugee Board, such as the legislation that was passed, and I think it was early 2013 around designated countries of origin. We always actively worked with provincial governments on immigration levels to determine the mix of economic and humanitarian and make sure that we had resources in place to support humanitarian immigration. But again, I would like to finish. It's interesting because the opposition party is getting a lot of questions on, okay, well, what would you do in response to a situation that this government has solely created, that I think in a lot of ways the starting point is for them to acknowledge that and to start giving some opposite messaging from where they're at. So again, I think this is firmly up to the Trudeau government to respond to. They need a plan, and they need to be transparent to Canadians about it.
But those people are crossing the border, and all specialists we talk to is once they've crossed the border, we have this responsibility to take care of them. I'm just not clear what your party would do if you were in government in this situation. You have this massive influx of people. What's your solution? To build a wall? To shoot them? To ship them back by bus?
First of all, what's your? I have to take some umbrage at the level of extremity that was just put in place in that question. That sort of rhetoric is very dangerous, even to suggest. And I think I want to repudiate that even being suggested. So number one.
I just want to know.
No, but this is the thing. We shouldn't be provoked in this situation. Being provoked in this situation is what leads to very polarized rhetoric, right? What we need is a calm, rational plan that deals with process efficiencies, dealing with, like, I look at the IRB backlog that's been created with these spikes. How do we both decrease demand on that system and ensure that the process is efficient? We proactively put in place something that was working with the designated countries of origin. That did reduce a lot of the backlogs. I never would have lifted the Mexican visa requirement without a formal review. There are all sorts of things that are what-ifs based on this government's policy decisions, right? At this point in time, things were working really well, and the government, when we left office, the government has created a lot of these things. So you need to ask them: what are you doing with the Mexican visa lift if we're seeing a giant spike in asylum claims? Are you going to go to the United States and uphold the Safe Third Country Agreement? Are you going to look at this loophole? Those are questions for the government. I would have loved to have this policy discussion with you after having a rigorous debate in the House of Commons with the government presenting a plan. I can't respond to that because they don't have one. And I think it's fair for them first to put something forward and certainly come up with that. I think it's very unfortunate that the situation that my party is in right now, and the question that you're asking me is, how would you clean up this mess? And I would like to start by saying I would like to acknowledge that Justin Trudeau thinks that there is one, so that conversation isn't stuck there.
But I guess
Thank
the
you.
reason why we're
I
asking
think we do have to wrap it up. We are running a little bit short on time, sorry. I think everyone who had their hand up got to ask a question, so we have to keep it to one round today. Thank you very much for coming to the National Press Theatre.
Thank you.